Chapter 1. Silent Snowfall. The first snowflakes of the season drifted down slowly, blanketing the town in a quiet hush. The streets, once filled with the busyness of everyday life, now stood still under the soft white cover, as if time itself had decided to pause. The evening sky, a muted gray, cast a dull light over the small town, where each building and tree seemed to be tucked under a pristine quilt of snow. In the distance, tall evergreen trees lined the horizon, their dark silhouettes stark against the pale background of the snow-covered fields. Beyond the town's edges, a sprawling estate, with grand windows and ivy creeping along its stone walls, stood isolated, as though it had forgotten the life that once flowed within. The estate was a relic of a bygone era, its ornate iron gates now rusted, and the garden overrun with untamed brambles. Yet, there was something both melancholic and beautiful about the way the snow wrapped the estate in an eerie silence, muting the world around it. In one of the upper windows of the mansion, a lone figure stood, staring out at the snowfall. Evelyn Lancaster, a woman in her mid-30s, pressed her fingertips against the cool glass, her breath forming faint clouds that faded almost as quickly as they appeared. Her face, pale like the snow, carried the weight of memories long buried, memories that seemed to stir with the onset of winter. The room behind her, dimly lit by the soft glow of a fireplace, was filled with the remnants of a life once lived with laughter, warmth, and love. Now, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of wind outside. She watched as the snowflakes fell in slow spirals, each one unique, like moments frozen in time. She felt as if her life, too, had been frozen in place, caught in an unending winter since that fateful Christmas many years ago. Each flake that settled on the ground was a reminder of what had been lost, of the love that had slipped through her fingers like grains of sand. She had been waiting for years for something, or perhaps someone, to break the silence of her heart, but nothing ever came. The snowfall was endless, just like the emptiness inside her. Her gaze moved downward, towards the garden now buried under snowdrifts. She had once tended that garden, planting roses and daffodils in spring, watching them bloom under the bright summer sun. But now, the garden was a frozen wasteland, much like her own soul. There was a time when she believed in the magic of Christmas, in the possibility of miracles, but that faith had withered away, buried beneath layers of sorrow. Suddenly, something caught her eye. A flicker of movement in the distance, barely noticeable, but enough to stir the quietness inside her. She leaned closer to the window, squinting through the falling snow. A shadow moved at the edge of the forest, just beyond the estate grounds. The figure, draped in a long, dark coat, walked slowly, deliberately, as if following an invisible path. The snow seemed to part in front of them, creating a trail that led toward the mansion. Evelyn's heart quickened. She hadn't had visitors in years, not since she had locked herself away from the world. The town had forgotten her, and she had, in turn, forgotten it. She wondered, for a moment, who this stranger might be. Perhaps someone lost in the storm? Or maybe it was just a passerby, seeking shelter. But there was something about the figure's movements that unsettled her, a familiarity she couldn't quite place. She moved away from the window, the warmth of the fire barely touching her as she paced the room. Her thoughts raced with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Why now? Why, after all these years of solitude, had someone decided to approach the mansion? She glanced back toward the window, but the figure had vanished, swallowed by the dense snow. Evelyn's hand instinctively reached for the key she always kept on a chain around her neck, the key to the front door that she hadn't opened in what felt like a lifetime. The house had become her sanctuary, her prison. She had sealed herself inside its walls, away from the outside world, away from the past that haunted her every step. And now, Someone was approaching, stirring memories she had tried so hard to forget. The snow outside continued to fall, heavier now, the sky darkening as night approached. She stood by the fire, watching the flames dance, feeling the heat against her skin, but the warmth did little to thaw the coldness that had settled deep within her. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to be drawn into the quiet crackle of the fire, the rhythmic fall of snow against the window. But just as she began to lose herself in the silence, a sharp knock echoed through the mansion, breaking the stillness like a clap of thunder. Her eyes flew open, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound reverberated through the empty halls, bouncing off the high ceilings, until it faded into the shadows. For a long moment, she stood frozen, unsure whether she had imagined the sound. But then, the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Her hand tightened around the key, and she felt a surge of fear and anticipation rise within her. Evelyn glanced toward the door of the room, as if it, too, had come alive with the presence of the stranger. She knew that opening the door would mean letting in more than just the cold. It would mean confronting the ghosts of her past, the love she had lost, and the truth she had buried beneath years of silence. The knock came a third time, echoing through the mansion like the tolling of a distant bell. And this time, Evelyn knew that the moment she had been dreading, the moment she had both feared and hoped for, had finally arrived. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the key in her hand, and slowly, she began to move toward the door. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in its quiet beauty. But inside the mansion, something was stirring. A spark in the darkness, a faint glimmer of hope, or perhaps of something far more dangerous. Chapter 2. A Glimpse of the Past. The knock at the door seemed to echo in Evelyn's mind long after it had faded from the air. Her heart raced, her pulse quickened, but her feet remained rooted to the floor. For years, the front door had remained firmly shut, and now, the thought of opening it, of letting someone into the hollow, quiet space she had grown so accustomed to, was almost unimaginable. Slowly, her fingers unfurled from the key hanging around her neck. The cold metal felt heavy in her hand, as if it were not merely the key to the door but the key to a past she had worked tirelessly to lock away. Her eyes darted back toward the window, where the snow continued to fall in thick curtains, blurring the outlines of the world beyond. The figure was gone, vanished into the swirling white storm, leaving only the fresh trail of footsteps leading up to the mansion's entrance. Evelyn took a step forward, then another, the sound of her boots scuffing softly against the floorboards. The mansion was vast and empty, every creak of the wood beneath her feet a reminder of the years of silence that had settled in the place like dust. The shadows seemed to stretch longer as she made her way toward the grand staircase, each step slow, hesitant, as if her very movement might awaken the dormant memories slumbering in the corners of the house. The winding staircase curved elegantly downward, a relic of the mansion's former grandeur. The banister, polished and ornate, was cold to the touch, like everything else in the house. Each step she took toward the front hall felt like descending deeper into a labyrinth of the past. Her eyes flickered over the darkened paintings lining the walls, portraits of ancestors she had never known, their faces stern and watchful, their eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused, glancing down the long corridor that led to the front door. It stretched out before her like a tunnel, its end barely visible in the dim light. The distant flicker of candles from the chandelier above the entryway cast long, wavering shadows across the floor, like the ghosts of forgotten years stretching out to greet her. She could feel the cold draft seeping through the cracks in the door, the wind howling softly against the stone walls of the estate. With each step closer, the memories pressed in tighter, their weight heavy on her chest. She could almost see herself, years ago, standing in this very hallway, her hands clasped around a suitcase, tears filling her eyes as she watched him walk out into the snowstorm, the sound of his footsteps growing fainter until there was nothing left but silence. She had never expected to see him again after that night, but the stranger outside was not him. Evelyn knew that much. Still, there was something about the presence of this new visitor that stirred the same ache in her chest, the same sense of longing and loss. As she approached the door, her hand hovered over the latch for a moment too long. Her breath caught in her throat. She imagined what it would be like to open it, to be met by the swirling gusts of wind, the biting cold of winter, and the unknown person standing on the other side. Was she ready for this? Could she bear to let someone else into the carefully constructed solitude she had created for herself? The mansion had become her refuge from the world, a place where the outside couldn't reach her. In these walls, she had buried herself along with her pain, hidden from the judgments and the whispers of the town. If she opened the door now, she would be inviting the world back in, along with all its chaos, its unpredictability, and its memories. Still, something urged her forward, some spark of curiosity, or perhaps a quiet desperation. The snow outside had long since covered the ground, but the footprints leading up to the door were fresh, clear. Whoever had knocked was still there, waiting for her. Her fingers brushed against the latch, the metal cold against her skin. A deep breath filled her lungs, and then, with a sudden surge of will, she unlocked the door. Slowly, carefully, she pulled it open. The winter wind rushed in first, biting at her skin, sending a chill through her bones. Snowflakes swirled past her, carried on the gusts, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to blend into a single white blur. But then, as the wind died down, the figure standing just beyond the threshold came into focus. A man stood in the snow, his long coat flapping in the wind, his head slightly bowed as if in thought. His face was shadowed by the hood of his coat, obscured by the snow and the twilight. He stood still, almost too still, as if he were waiting for her next move. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. For a fleeting moment, she was sure she knew him. Her mind raced through the years, the faces, the people she had once known. But she couldn't place him. There was something hauntingly familiar about the way he stood there, the way the snow seemed to part around him, yet she knew she had never seen him before. Or had she? The man lifted his head slowly, his features becoming clearer in the faint light. His eyes, deep, dark, and filled with a kind of quiet intensity, met hers. There was no malice in them, no threat, but something about his gaze unnerved her, as if he could see straight through the layers of isolation and grief she had wrapped herself in. He reached into his coat and, for a brief moment, Evelyn's heart stopped, a surge of fear shooting through her. But then his hand emerged, holding not a weapon, but a small, carefully wrapped package, tied with a simple red ribbon. He held it out to her, his gloved hand steady, as though this moment had been planned long ago. Evelyn stared at the package, her mind racing. What could it be? Who was this man, and why had he come? Every instinct she had screamed to retreat back into the safety of her solitude, to close the door and lock it behind her, to let the snow and the wind erase the footsteps leading to her home. But the man's eyes held her there, his presence stirring something deep within her, something she had long thought frozen. After what felt like an eternity, she reached out, her hand trembling as she took the package from his. The weight of it in her hand was surprisingly light, but it felt significant, as though it carried more than just its physical contents. The man nodded once, his expression unreadable, and then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the snow. Evelyn stood there, the package clutched tightly in her hands, watching as the figure faded into the storm. The wind picked up again, and the snow quickly filled the footprints he left behind, erasing any trace of his visit. She closed the door, the warmth of the house enveloping her once again, but her thoughts were far from settled. She stared down at the small package, her fingers tracing the red ribbon, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was this stranger, and why had he come? What was inside the package, and what did it mean? The mansion was silent once more, but the stillness no longer felt like a comfort. It felt like the calm before something much larger, much more unsettling. As the snow continued to fall outside, Evelyn's thoughts swirled just as wildly. She knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Chapter 3: Whispers of December. The package sat on the table, untouched. The red ribbon, now loose from Evelyn's fingers, lay coiled beside it like a forgotten thread. She stood in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the small, unassuming box. The crackling fire behind her cast flickering shadows against the walls, but even its warmth seemed distant and disconnected from the sudden tension that had settled over the space. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, the wind howling like a restless spirit through the trees. The mansion creaked under the pressure of the gusts, its ancient bones groaning with the weight of time. But within, all was still, save for the rapid beating of Evelyn's heart. She hadn't moved since closing the door. Her mind raced with questions, spinning webs of confusion and unease. Who had the man been? His face, though shadowed, remained etched in her memory. Those intense, quiet eyes that seemed to look right through her, as though he knew her story without her ever speaking a word. And the package, light as it was, felt like a burden now, its presence almost accusatory, demanding her attention. The firelight played across its surface, highlighting the simplicity of the brown paper and the neatly tied ribbon. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, and yet it carried with it an inexplicable weight, a sense of significance that gnawed at her. She wanted to open it, to see what was inside, but at the same time, she feared what it might reveal. Something about the package felt deliberate. It wasn't just a gift. It was a message. Evelyn stepped closer to the table, her fingertips grazing the edge of the box, but she recoiled slightly, as if the contents might bite. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, flashes of the past, memories long buried, resurfaced without warning. She could see it all so clearly now. Christmases spent in this very room, when the mansion was alive with laughter, when the smell of pine and cinnamon filled the air, when love seemed like something real, tangible. But those days were gone, reduced to little more than faded memories, like the worn-out photographs tucked away in forgotten drawers. The last Christmas she had spent here was the one that changed everything. She could still remember the bitter cold of that night, the way the snow had fallen thick and fast, much like tonight. She had stood by the same window, watching the same snowfall, waiting for someone who never came back. Her fingers brushed against the box again, this time lingering. She could feel the knot in her chest tighten, that old familiar ache of loss returning to the surface. It had been years since she'd allowed herself to think about him, the man she had loved and lost. He had promised to return that night, the night of the storm, but he never did. She had waited, as the hours slipped into days, as the snow piled higher and higher. And in the end, all that was left was silence. No explanations, no letters, no closure. He had vanished from her life as quickly as the snow melted in spring. A deep breath filled her lungs as she pulled herself back from the edge of those memories. The man tonight couldn't have known about her past. He was a stranger. And yet, something about his presence, his silent offering of the package, felt too coincidental, too specific. Evelyn walked to the window and stared out into the night, hoping the view might offer some clarity. The snow outside was thick now, swirling in dense waves, almost completely obscuring the landscape beyond. The trees swayed under the force of the storm, their branches heavy with snow. It was as if the world outside was being wiped clean, every trace of the past erased by the storm's fury. Yet inside her mind, the past was anything but erased. It was alive, present, haunting her with every breath. She had tried so hard to forget, to move on, but the arrival of this stranger, this package, had opened a door she had long since closed. She turned away from the window and moved back toward the table, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floors. The shadows of the fire flickered and danced, casting a strange glow over the room. For a moment, the mansion seemed almost alive, the air charged with something she couldn't quite place. It was as if the house itself was watching, waiting for her to make the next move. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers once again grazing the edges of the box. She sat down at the table, her eyes fixed on the simple wrapping, the knot in her chest tightening further. She had spent so many years avoiding the past, pushing it down, pretending it didn't exist. And now, it was sitting in front of her, wrapped neatly in brown paper, tied with a red ribbon. Slowly, almost ritualistically, she reached for the package. Her fingers worked the ribbon loose, each pull of the knot feeling like the undoing of something inside her. The ribbon slipped away, and the paper fell open, revealing a small, delicately carved wooden box beneath. Evelyn stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. The wood was smooth, polished, with intricate designs etched into the surface, swirling vines and snowflakes, the craftsmanship elegant and precise. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was familiar. She had seen this box before. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the wooden lid, her heart thundering in her chest. Inside, nestled against the soft velvet lining, was a delicate silver locket. The moment she saw it, a wave of emotion surged through her, overwhelming in its intensity. She remembered this locket, the one she had given him, all those years ago. It had been a symbol of their love, a promise of a future together. She had never seen it again after he disappeared. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal, the weight of it small but significant in her palm. The locket was just as she remembered, its surface engraved with the same delicate patterns, the same initials, hers and his. A small clasp at the side beckoned her to open it, but she hesitated. Inside, she knew there would be a picture of the two of them, smiling, happy, oblivious to the heartbreak that would soon follow. For a long moment, she simply sat there, the locket resting in her hand, her mind racing with questions. How had this come to be here? Who was the man who had delivered it, and how had he known? The memories rushed back with a force she hadn't expected, pulling her under like a riptide. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the unresolved grief, the unanswered questions. The fire crackled softly behind her, the only sound in the room, as Evelyn closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. The locket, the wooden box, the snowstorm. It all felt like too much, like the walls of the mansion were closing in around her. She had spent so many years trying to bury this part of her life, trying to convince herself that it didn't matter, that she had moved on. But now, sitting here with the locket in her hand, she realized just how deeply those wounds still ran. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to confront the truth of what had happened that night. But the locket, the stranger's arrival, the eerie quiet of the snowstorm, it all felt like a message, a sign that the time for silence was over. Evelyn's gaze drifted back to the window, where the snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, obscuring everything in its path. The storm was far from over, and something told her that the answers she sought were still out there, buried beneath the snow, waiting to be uncovered. With a deep breath, She closed the locket and placed it back inside the wooden box. Her hands still trembled as she secured the lid, but something had shifted within her. The past was no longer something she could hide from. It was here, inescapable, whispering to her through the cold winds of December. And this time, she would listen. Chapter 4: Shadows in the Snow. Evelyn awoke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the heavy curtains of her bedroom, casting an icy glow over the room. The snowstorm had raged all night, its howling winds pressing against the mansion like a living force. Now, in the stillness of morning, the world outside lay buried beneath a thick, pristine layer of snow. It was as if the storm had swept away every trace of life, leaving only an untouched, silent landscape. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on her. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by the stranger's visit, the mysterious package, and the silver locket that had once meant everything to her. The memories that had stirred within her felt raw and fresh, as if no time had passed since the night he had disappeared. Evelyn sat up slowly, the familiar ache in her chest returning. She glanced toward the wooden box on the bedside table, its presence both comforting and unsettling. The locket inside held more than just the memory of her lost love. It held the unanswered questions of her past. And now, with the stranger's appearance, those questions were resurfacing, demanding to be faced. She dressed slowly, pulling on a thick sweater and warm trousers, preparing herself for the cold that waited outside her door. The mansion felt emptier than ever, the vastness of its rooms echoing with the absence of life. Each step she took down the long, winding staircase felt heavy, as if the weight of the past was dragging her down. When she reached the front hall, the scene outside the window took her breath away. The snow had transformed the world into a glistening white expanse, the trees weighed down by the sheer volume of it. The driveway was completely obscured, and the path leading up to the house was buried beneath feet of snow. No footprints remained from the man who had visited last night. It was as if he had never been there at all. Evelyn's gaze lingered on the snow-covered landscape for a long time. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the stillness, but it also felt oppressive, like the weight of her isolation had grown with the storm. She had spent years hiding herself away in this mansion, but now the very walls that had once protected her felt like a prison. Her thoughts drifted to the locket again, to the memory of the man who had once been her world. His absence had left a hole in her life that nothing had ever filled, and now, with the locket returned to her, it felt like his presence was once again looming over her, even though he was long gone. But why had it returned now? And why had a stranger been the one to deliver it? Determined to shake the feeling of helplessness that clung to her, Evelyn turned away from the window and made her way to the back of the house, where the kitchen and garden lay. The kitchen was one of the few places in the mansion that still held a sense of warmth, though even that had diminished over the years. She had stopped using the grand dining room after his disappearance, finding it too large, too empty for one person. Instead, she spent her mornings here, in the cozy space with its worn wooden table and faded curtains. The garden beyond the kitchen door had once been her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the weight of her thoughts. But now it lay buried beneath the snow, the delicate rose bushes and ivy-covered walls hidden from view. The sight filled her with a strange sense of loss, as though the garden's beauty had been stolen away by the storm, just as so much else had been taken from her. Evelyn filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, the sound of the bubbling water the only noise breaking the silence. As the steam began to rise, she leaned against the counter, her mind drifting once again to the past. She had been so young then, so full of hope. The mansion had been her childhood home, a place filled with laughter and family gatherings. But it had also been the place where she had met him. He had been a traveler, passing through the small town nestled at the base of the mountains. His charm, His kindness, his quiet strength had drawn her in almost immediately. They had spent that winter together, wrapped in the warmth of their growing love, sheltered from the world by the heavy snow. It had felt like something out of a dream, too perfect to be real. And perhaps that had been the problem, because dreams always end. Evelyn stared down at the wooden floor, her thoughts a jumble of emotions. She had never found out what had happened to him, whether he had left her intentionally or if something more sinister had occurred. The town had whispered, of course. They had always whispered about her, the lonely woman living in the grand, crumbling mansion. But she had learned to shut out the noise, to keep her grief and her questions locked away where no one could see them. But now, with the locket back in her possession, the questions were louder than ever. The past was no longer something she could ignore. It had come back to her, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon, brought to her by a stranger whose motives she still didn't understand. The kettle whistled sharply, pulling her from her thoughts. She poured the hot water into a cup, the steam rising in soft tendrils. As she stirred in a spoonful of honey, she caught sight of something through the window. A movement, quick and subtle, out in the garden. Her heart skipped a beat. She moved closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. At first, she saw nothing but the expanse of snow, the frozen branches of the trees, the stillness of the morning. But then, just at the edge of the garden, near the old stone wall, she saw it again. A figure, moving slowly through the snow. It was the man from last night. She was sure of it. Her pulse quickened as she watched him, his dark coat standing out starkly against the white landscape. He wasn't looking toward the house. Instead, he seemed to be examining the garden, his movements deliberate, as though he were searching for something. Evelyn's mind raced. What was he doing here again? Why hadn't he left after delivering the package? A sense of unease settled over her as she watched him, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She had thought the locket was the end of it, but now it seemed there was more, something she hadn't anticipated. The man knelt down near one of the rose bushes, brushing away the snow with his gloved hands. Evelyn felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity as she watched him. What was he looking for? Without thinking, she moved to the back door and grabbed her coat from the hook on the wall. The cold hit her immediately as she stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath her boots. She could feel the sharp bite of the winter air on her skin, but she barely noticed it. Her eyes were fixed on the figure ahead of her, still bent over the rose bush. As she approached, the man straightened, as if sensing her presence. He didn't turn to face her, but there was something about the way he stood, the stillness of his posture, that unsettled her. She hesitated for a moment, the questions on the tip of her tongue, even though she knew she wouldn't speak them aloud. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees beyond the garden. Evelyn stood there, her breath clouding the air, staring after him. The snow had already begun to cover his footprints, erasing any trace of his presence once again. She moved toward the rose bush, her eyes scanning the ground where he had knelt. There, half buried in the snow, was something small and metallic, glinting in the weak winter light. Her heart raced as she crouched down and brushed the snow away. It was another locket, identical to the one she had found in the package. Evelyn stared at it, her mind spinning. Why had he left this here? What did it mean? She clutched the locket in her hand, the cold metal biting into her skin, as a sense of dread washed over her. The shadows in the snow seemed to stretch longer as she stood there, the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on her like never before. Chapter 5. The Unseen Threads. Evelyn's breath formed small clouds in the air as she held the second locket in her trembling hand, the cold seeping through her gloves and into her skin. Her fingers closed around the delicate metal, its icy surface biting against her palm. The snow continued to fall lightly around her, dusting her hair and coat in a fine layer of white. The man had vanished into the forest beyond the garden, leaving nothing but the fading outline of his footprints. She stood alone in the silence, the only sound the faint rustle of the trees in the bitter wind. The locket felt heavier than it should have, weighted by the unanswered questions swirling in her mind. 2 lockets now, both identical, both mysteriously returned to her after all these years. The first had been delivered to her doorstep, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. But this one had been left intentionally in her garden, as if placed there for her to find. The man's actions were deliberate, calculated, and the thought made her stomach twist with unease. What did it mean? Why was he here? And why had he returned these lockets? Evelyn felt a familiar pang of grief as she thought of the man she had once loved, the one who had vanished into the night without a trace. He had taken the locket she had given him, her locket, her love, her trust, and disappeared. And now, after all these years, the lockets were coming back to her, as if drawn from the shadows of the past by unseen hands. Evelyn turned toward the house, her boots sinking into the fresh snow as she made her way across the garden. The cold bit at her cheeks, and the weight of the locket in her hand seemed to grow heavier with each step. The air around her was sharp and still, the distant whisper of the wind the only sound that accompanied her. It felt as if the world had been suspended in time, the snow acting as a veil that muffled everything, drawing her deeper into the mystery that was unraveling before her. When she reached the back door of the mansion, she paused for a moment, her fingers lingering on the doorknob as she glanced back toward the garden. The trees stood silent and tall, their branches heavy with snow, and the path where the stranger had walked was already beginning to disappear beneath the falling flakes. The garden, once her sanctuary, now felt unfamiliar, as though it held secrets she had never noticed before. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Inside, the warmth of the mansion enveloped her, but it did little to ease the chill that had settled deep within her. She removed her coat and gloves, her fingers still tingling from the cold, and carefully placed the second locket on the kitchen table beside the first. The 2 lockets lay side by side, identical in every way, their silver surfaces reflecting the dim light from the kitchen window. They seemed to glimmer with a strange energy, as if they held the answers to the questions that haunted her. Evelyn sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her gaze fixed on the lockets. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Had the man come to return something that belonged to her? Or was this some sort of cruel game, meant to reopen old wounds? The lockets had been a symbol of love once, a promise of a future together. But now, they felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite understand. Her thoughts drifted back to the night he had disappeared, the last time she had seen him. The snow had been falling then too, thick and heavy, just like tonight. She had waited for him by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow over the room. He had promised to return before midnight, but as the hours ticked by, her hope had slowly faded, replaced by a cold, gnawing fear. When morning came, there had been no sign of him. The snow had covered everything, erasing any trace of his presence. And now, after so many years, these lockets were the only tangible reminder of what they had once shared. Evelyn's hands shook slightly as she reached for the first locket. She ran her fingers over the delicate engraving, the initials carved into the silver, hers and his. The clasp was stiff from years of disuse, but it clicked open with a soft sound, revealing the small photograph inside. It was faded now, the edges worn from time, but the image was unmistakable. It was a picture of the 2 of them, standing side by side in the garden on a summer's day, their faces lit with joy. She had almost forgotten what he looked like, how his eyes had sparkled with life, how his smile had made her feel as though the world had stopped just for them. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she closed the locket, the memories too painful to linger on for long. She placed it back on the table, her hands unsteady. Then, hesitating for only a moment, she reached for the second locket. The metal was cold against her skin, the clasp stiff but familiar. Slowly, she opened it. Inside was another photograph, but this one was different. It wasn't from their time together. It was recent, taken sometime in the last few years. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the image. It was a picture of her, standing in the very same garden where she had found the locket, her face turned toward the house. She looked older, more weary, the weight of the years visible in the lines of her face. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to understand what she was seeing. Who had taken this photo? And why was it inside the locket? The realization hit her like a wave, cold and overwhelming. Someone had been watching her. Someone had been following her, capturing her life without her knowledge. The second locket wasn't just a message from the past. It was a message from the present. The man who had delivered it wasn't just some stranger. He knew her, had been observing her, and now he was leaving her these tokens as a way to reach her, to draw her in. Her pulse quickened, and a knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She had been living in this mansion for so long, secluded from the rest of the world, believing herself to be safe in her isolation. But now, it was clear that someone had been watching her all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Evelyn rose from the table, her legs unsteady. She moved toward the window, her eyes scanning the snow-covered garden for any sign of movement. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches dusted with snow, but there was no sign of the man, no indication that anyone had been there at all. Her mind raced with 100 different possibilities. Who was he? Why had he come back now, after all these years? And what did he want from her? The answers seemed to slip through her fingers like sand, elusive and distant. But one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore this any longer. The past wasn't just something that had happened to her. It was something that was still unfolding, still shaping her present. And the man, whoever he was, held the key to understanding it all. As the shadows lengthened outside and the last light of day began to fade, Evelyn knew she had to make a choice. She could continue to hide, to retreat into the safety of her memories, or she could confront the mystery that had reawakened in her life. The lockets, the photographs, the stranger. They were all threads in a web that had been woven around her for years, and now it was tightening. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stood by the window, staring out into the falling snow. The lockets lay on the kitchen table behind her, silent reminders of the past and the future. And somewhere out there, in the cold and the dark, the answers awaited her. Chapter 6. The Haunting Echoes. Night descended on the mansion with a creeping stillness, wrapping the world in a thick, suffocating darkness. Evelyn had drawn the heavy curtains shut against the cold. Yet the wind howled faintly through the cracks of the old windows, bringing with it a chill that clung to her skin. The snowstorm had eased, but its remnants remained outside, a frozen wasteland illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. The silence within the mansion was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling against the weight of time. The two lockets sat side by side on the small wooden table in the corner of the living room, their silver surfaces glinting faintly in the firelight. Evelyn had spent hours staring at them, turning the events of the last few days over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of the strange occurrences that had pulled her from the solitude she had so carefully crafted for herself. She felt as though she were trapped in a waking dream, one in which the past and the present were entwined so tightly that she could no longer distinguish between them. The photograph in the second locket had unsettled her deeply. How long had someone been watching her? And for what purpose? It was no coincidence that the man had delivered it to her, but what he wanted, what his intentions were, remained a mystery. Evelyn felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her, a sensation both familiar and terrifying. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Evelyn sat on the edge of the worn armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind lost in thought. She had tried to distract herself by reading, by organizing the old books that lined the dusty shelves of the mansion's library, but nothing could hold her attention for long. The questions gnawed at her, demanding to be answered. Her thoughts drifted back to the night when he had vanished, the night that had changed everything. The winter had been harsh, much like this one, and the snow had fallen relentlessly for days. She had waited for him by the window, watching the snow swirl in the moonlight, her heart full of hope. But as the hours had slipped by, hope had turned to worry, and worry had turned to dread. By morning, the world outside had been buried in snow, and he had been gone. The town had whispered its cruel speculations. They had said that he had simply left, that he had grown tired of the isolated life she offered him. Others had suggested darker possibilities, hinting at accidents or foul play. But no one had known the truth. No one but Evelyn had known the depth of the love they had shared, the promises they had made to each other. She had refused to believe he would leave without a word. Yet no trace of him had ever been found. And now, all these years later, the lockets had returned, symbols of a love that had been stolen from her. But what did it mean? Why had they been brought back now, after so much time had passed? The man in the dark coat, the stranger who had appeared out of the snow, held the answers. But finding him was another matter entirely. Evelyn rose from the chair and moved to the window, parting the thick curtains just enough to peer out into the night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the snow-covered landscape. The trees in the garden stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with frost. For a moment, she imagined she could see him again. The mysterious man moving through the garden, his figure barely visible against the pale backdrop. But the garden was empty, and the only movement came from the wind, which stirred the snow in soft, swirling eddies. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned her attention to the fireplace, the warmth of the flames doing little to ease the coldness that had settled in her chest. Her mind was full of fragmented thoughts, memories, and the lingering feeling that something was about to happen, that the lockets were only the beginning of something larger, something she couldn't yet grasp. The mansion had always felt like a refuge, a place where she could escape from the world and lose herself in her own thoughts. But now, it felt different. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows darker, the air heavier. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next revelation to unfold. The familiar creaks and groans of the old building no longer felt comforting. Instead, they seemed to carry a warning, a reminder that she was not alone, even when she appeared to be. Evelyn's gaze drifted back to the lockets on the table, their presence an inescapable reminder of the mystery that had re-entered her life. She could feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on her, filling her with a sense of dread that refused to be shaken. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain composed, to keep her emotions tightly controlled, but now that composure was slipping. She reached out and picked up the second locket, turning it over in her hand. The cold metal was smooth beneath her fingers, and the clasp clicked open with a soft sound. The photograph inside stared back at her, haunting in its familiarity. Her own face, captured in a moment she hadn't known was being observed, reminded her of how vulnerable she truly was. The thought that someone had been watching her, following her, sent a chill down her spine. Who was this man? And why had he chosen to involve her in this way? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the answers might lie not in the present, but in the past. Perhaps the mystery wasn't just about him. It was about everything that had happened before, about the secrets that had been buried beneath the snow and forgotten for so many years. Evelyn's heart raced as the idea took hold of her. What if the lockets were more than just symbols of a lost love? What if they were clues, pieces of a puzzle that had been left behind for her to solve? The thought filled her with a strange mixture of fear and excitement, as if she were on the verge of discovering something long hidden. But where to begin? The mansion was filled with memories, with echoes of the past that lingered in every room, every piece of furniture, every worn photograph. She had spent years avoiding those memories, locking them away in the attic of her mind, too painful to confront. But now, it seemed that the time had come to face them, to dig through the layers of her past and uncover whatever truth had been waiting for her all this time. Her decision made, Evelyn moved toward the staircase that led to the upper floors of the mansion. The steps creaked under her weight as she ascended, the old wood protesting against the years of neglect. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, the warmth from the fire in the living room unable to reach this part of the house. The hallways above were dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the narrow windows at the end of the corridor. Evelyn hesitated at the top of the stairs, her hand resting on the banister. The attic door loomed ahead of her, a place she had avoided for so long that it had become almost a forbidden space in her mind. The attic had once been a place of storage, filled with old trunks and forgotten relics from her family's history. But after his disappearance, she had begun to associate it with loss, with the things she had chosen to forget. Taking a deep breath, she moved forward, her steps slow and deliberate. The door to the attic was stiff with age, and it took some effort to open, the hinges groaning in protest as she pushed it inward. A rush of cold air greeted her, thick with the smell of dust and old wood. The narrow staircase that led up to the attic was barely illuminated, but she didn't hesitate. As she reached the top of the stairs, her heart pounded in her chest. The attic was just as she remembered, cluttered with old trunks, boxes, and forgotten belongings. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a small, grimy window that barely let in any moonlight. She moved slowly through the space, her eyes scanning the room for anything that might hold a clue. Her gaze fell on a large wooden trunk in the corner, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. She knelt down in front of it, brushing away the dust with her hands. The lock was rusted but still intact, and with a little effort, she managed to pry it open. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, photographs, and documents, all neatly bundled together with worn ribbons. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the first bundle, the paper brittle with age. The letters were addressed to her, written in a familiar hand, his hand. She hadn't known these letters existed. They had been hidden away, forgotten in the attic all these years. Her heart raced as she unfolded the first letter, her eyes scanning the faded words. It was a love letter, written during the early days of their relationship, filled with promises of a future together. The words were tender, filled with hope and longing, but there was something else hidden between the lines, something she hadn't noticed before. A sense of urgency, of desperation, as though he had been trying to tell her something important, something she had missed. Evelyn's mind raced as she sifted through the letters, each one revealing more pieces of the puzzle. There were hints of secrets, of things he hadn't been able to say aloud. And then, in the final letter, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a cryptic message, written in his familiar hand, but with a tone that was darker, more ominous. He had been in danger. He had known something was coming, something that had forced him to leave. And now, all these years later, the lockets and the photograph were part of that same mystery, a mystery that was far from over. As Evelyn sat in the cold, dim attic, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. Chapter 7. Secrets beneath the snow. The attic felt colder than the rest of the house, as though time itself had frozen there, caught in the dust-covered relics of a forgotten past. Evelyn remained kneeling by the trunk, her breath barely a whisper in the stillness, the letters scattered around her like fallen leaves. The cryptic message in the final letter weighed heavily in her hands, its meaning elusive yet unmistakably ominous. The words, written so long ago, hinted at dangers that had lingered beyond her understanding, waiting for her to uncover them. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of an abyss, peering into the shadows of a past that refused to remain buried. The mansion, once her sanctuary, had begun to feel like a labyrinth, its every corner filled with echoes of things unsaid, of lives intertwined in ways she hadn't fully grasped. The snowstorm that had blanketed the outside world had also covered over memories, secrets she had unknowingly locked away. Now, with the discovery of the letters, it was as though the storm was lifting, revealing truths she had not wanted to see. The fire downstairs crackled faintly, its warmth too far away to reach her. The cold in the attic seemed to seep into her bones, but she didn't move. She turned the letter over again, reading the words with a growing sense of dread. The urgency in his writing was clear, but what had he feared? What danger had driven him away? Only to leave her with these fragments of a mystery that had never fully unraveled. Her mind raced back to that fateful winter night when everything had changed. The snow had fallen just as heavily then, and she had stood at the window, waiting for him. She had been so certain that he would return, that he would keep his promise, but the hours had passed in silence, and by morning, the world outside had been buried beneath a thick layer of snow. The only thing left of him had been his absence, an emptiness that had haunted her ever since. For years, she had tried to move on, to fill that emptiness with the mundane tasks of life. She had gone through the motions, keeping the mansion in order, watching the seasons change, but always, the shadow of that winter night had loomed over her, refusing to fade. Now, with the lockets, the photograph, and the letters, it was as though the past had returned with a vengeance, demanding to be understood. Evelyn carefully gathered the letters, placing them back into the trunk. The documents and photographs that accompanied them were old, some so fragile that they threatened to disintegrate at her touch. She found old deeds, family records, and a few more personal items that seemed to belong to a history much older than her own. But nothing answered the pressing question. Where had he gone, and why had he left behind these cryptic clues? The air in the attic felt stifling, despite the cold. The weight of the years pressed down on her, the silence around her thick with the presence of the past. She closed the trunk with a soft thud, the sound startling in the stillness. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of what to do next. The letters had opened a door to the past, but stepping through it felt dangerous, as though she were treading on fragile ground. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her hands, and made her way back down the narrow staircase. The wooden steps creaked beneath her weight, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent house. As she descended, the warmth of the lower floors enveloped her, but it did little to ease the chill that had settled deep inside her. Back in the living room, the fire was dying, its once bright flames reduced to glowing embers. She knelt before it, adding another log, watching as the fire slowly began to revive, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The two lockets sat untouched on the table, their presence a constant reminder of the strange events that had brought her to this point. Her eyes lingered on them, drawn once again to the photograph inside the second locket. It was unsettling to think that someone had been watching her, following her, without her knowledge. How long had this been happening? And what was the connection to him? The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the man who had delivered the locket held the answers. but finding him seemed an impossible task. He had vanished into the snowstorm as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only questions in his wake. Evelyn sat back in the armchair, her gaze still fixed on the fire, her mind drifting through the memories of the past. She had always been a person of solitude, content to live in the quiet isolation of the mansion. But now, the isolation felt oppressive, the silence too heavy to bear. The mystery that had been thrust upon her had awakened something deep inside her, a need to uncover the truth, no matter how painful or dangerous it might be. The house around her seemed to creak and groan in response, the old wood settling under the weight of its years. The wind outside had picked up again, howling faintly through the cracks in the windows, bringing with it the sound of the snow shifting in the garden. She could almost imagine the stranger out there, moving through the snow like a ghost, watching her from the shadows. As the hours passed, the fire grew brighter, casting a warm glow over the room. But despite the comfort of the flames, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. She could feel it in the air, in the way the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The storm outside continued, the wind whistling through the trees, the snow piling higher and higher against the windows. The mansion was a world unto itself, isolated from the rest of the world, cut off by the snow and the secrets it held. Evelyn knew that she couldn't remain passive any longer. The answers were out there, buried beneath the snow, hidden in the fragments of the past she had long avoided. With a sense of determination, she rose from the armchair and moved toward the table where the lockets lay. She picked them up, one in each hand, feeling the weight of them against her palms. They were cold, their surfaces smooth and unyielding, but inside them lay the keys to the mystery that had consumed her life. She needed to find the man who had brought them to her. He was the link between the past and the present, the only person who could help her understand what had happened, and what might still happen. But how could she find him in a world buried beneath snow, in a town that had long forgotten the tragedy that had shaped her life? The questions swirled in her mind as she stood there, staring at the lockets in her hands. The fire crackled softly in the background, its warmth a stark contrast to the coldness of the night outside. Evelyn knew that she couldn't wait for the answers to come to her. She would have to seek them out, no matter where they led. Her decision made, she placed the lockets carefully back on the table and moved toward the front door. The storm outside was relentless, but she no longer cared. She had spent too many years trapped in the shadows of the past, and now it was time to face whatever waited for her in the snow. The truth, no matter how dark, was the only way forward. Evelyn reached for her coat and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. The cold air rushed in as she opened the door, the wind biting at her face as she stepped out into the night. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way toward the garden, the world around her silent except for the howling of the wind. The mansion stood behind her, its windows dark and foreboding, a shadow against the snowy landscape. But Evelyn didn't look back. She pressed forward, her heart racing with the knowledge that something waited for her out there, something that had been hidden for far too long. And as she disappeared into the swirling snow, she knew that her search for the truth had only just begun. Chapter 8: Whispers in the Wind. The snowstorm intensified, swirling violently around Evelyn as she trudged forward into the night. Each step was a struggle, her boots sinking into the thick snow that had blanketed the ground, turning the world into a vast, frozen wasteland. The wind howled, biting at her exposed skin, tugging at her coat with icy fingers as though trying to pull her back. Yet, she pressed on, her heart pounding in her chest, driven by a determination that overshadowed the biting cold. There was no turning back now. The garden stretched out before her, almost unrecognizable beneath the heavy snow. The trees, once towering and full of life, were now skeletal figures draped in white, their branches sagging under the weight of ice. The path that had once been so familiar was hidden, lost beneath layers of snow, forcing her to move by instinct, trusting her memory of the mansion's grounds. But the storm had transformed everything, casting an eerie, otherworldly glow over the landscape, making her feel as though she had stepped into a realm outside of time. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the frigid air, mingling with the snowflakes that stung her cheeks. Her eyes watered from the wind, but she refused to blink, staring ahead into the shifting storm. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that she needed to move, to act, to find something or someone who could lead her to the truth. As she moved further into the garden, a strange sensation settled over her, a feeling that she wasn't alone. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of her neck, the faintest sense of being watched. But the feeling grew stronger with each passing moment, until it became an oppressive weight, bearing down on her with an intensity that made her pause. She stopped, standing still in the center of the garden, her breath hitching in her throat. The wind continued to rage around her, but beneath its howl, she thought she could hear something else. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, carried on the wind like a whisper, soft, elusive, and chilling. It was as though the storm itself was speaking, its voice woven into the gusts that whipped around her. Evelyn strained to listen, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the words remained just out of reach, lost in the swirling snow. For a moment, she considered turning back. The safety of the mansion called to her, its dark windows barely visible through the storm. But something inside her refused to retreat. She had come this far, and whatever was out there, whatever secrets the snow held, she needed to uncover them. The sense of urgency from the letters was too strong to ignore. There were answers waiting, hidden beneath the layers of mystery and time, and she was determined to find them. She turned away from the mansion and pressed forward once more, her footsteps leaving deep impressions in the snow. The garden stretched on endlessly, the once well-kept hedges now shapeless mounds, the pathways obscured, everything swallowed by the relentless storm. The whispering sound persisted, growing louder the deeper she ventured into the garden. It wasn't a voice exactly, but it felt like one, an insistent, unnerving presence that seemed to call her forward. Suddenly, Evelyn's foot struck something solid beneath the snow. She stumbled, catching herself just before she fell, her heart leaping into her throat. She glanced down, her gloved hand brushing the snow aside, revealing the rough, worn surface of an old stone. She knelt, wiping away more of the snow to uncover what lay beneath, her pulse quickening with anticipation. It was a marker, ancient and weathered by time. The stone was cold to the touch, its surface cracked and covered in a thin layer of frost. As she brushed away more snow, she could just make out the faint, barely legible carvings etched into the stone. It was a grave marker, hidden beneath the garden all these years. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she traced the letters, her mind racing. The name was worn away, but there was no mistaking its significance. This grave had been deliberately hidden, concealed beneath the beauty of the garden. Who had been buried here? And why had this grave been forgotten, erased from the history of the mansion? Her thoughts drifted back to the letters, to the strange, cryptic words that had hinted at danger, at a secret buried beneath the surface of her life. Could this grave be connected to the man who had disappeared, leaving her with nothing but questions? Had he known about this place? Was this why he had vanished so suddenly, fleeing from something that had been too dangerous to face? The whispering on the wind seemed to grow louder as Evelyn stood over the grave, her mind swirling with possibilities. The storm raged around her, but in that moment, everything felt eerily still, as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. She could feel the weight of the years pressing down on her, the secrets of the past clawing their way to the surface, demanding to be uncovered. Without warning, the wind shifted, sending a flurry of snow across the grave, obscuring it once again. Evelyn stood, blinking against the onslaught of snow, her heart pounding in her chest. She had found something important, but she couldn't stay here any longer. The storm was growing too fierce, the cold too biting. She needed to return to the house, to regroup, to think. She turned and made her way back through the garden, her legs heavy with exhaustion. The snow was deeper now, making each step harder than the last, but she pushed on, driven by the knowledge that the answers were close. The mansion loomed ahead of her, dark and foreboding, its presence both a comfort and a reminder of the mysteries it held. As she approached the front door, she paused for a moment, glancing back over her shoulder at the garden. The wind howled, swirling the snow into an impenetrable wall, but in the distance, she thought she saw something. An indistinct figure moving through the storm, barely visible against the whiteness of the snow. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart skipping a beat. Was it her imagination? Or was there truly someone out there, watching her? The figure disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the storm. Evelyn stood frozen, her mind racing, unsure of what she had just seen. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. But this time it was accompanied by a chill that went deeper than the cold air. She wasn't alone. With trembling hands, she pulled the door open and stepped inside, the warmth of the house closing around her like a protective cocoon. She leaned against the door, her heart racing, her thoughts in disarray. She had come so close to the truth, but now, with the figure in the storm and the hidden grave in the garden, the mystery felt darker, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The fire still burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Evelyn moved toward it, her body shivering uncontrollably from the cold and the fear that had gripped her. The lockets sat untouched on the table, gleaming faintly in the firelight, their presence a stark reminder of the path she had chosen to follow. She knelt by the fire, holding her hands out to the flames, trying to warm herself. But no matter how close she moved to the heat, the chill inside her refused to fade. Something was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the way the house seemed to creak and groan around her, as though it, too, was aware of the impending storm. The answers were out there, buried beneath the snow, hidden in the shadows of the past. And soon, she would have to face them, whether she was ready or not. Chapter 9. Fading Footprints. The morning light was faint, barely a glimmer through the thick clouds that still hung heavy in the sky. The storm had subsided somewhat, but the world outside remained enshrouded in white, as though the earth itself had been swallowed by the snow. The mansion stood still, the quiet broken only by the occasional creak of its ancient bones shifting in response to the cold. Evelyn stood at the window, staring out at the pristine landscape, her mind heavy with the discoveries of the previous night. The figure in the storm, the grave in the garden. Everything felt so close, yet impossibly distant, as though the past itself were reaching out to her, tugging her further into its depths. Her thoughts drifted back to the grave she had uncovered. The name was barely legible, but there was no mistaking the significance of what she had found. It had been deliberately hidden, buried beneath the garden as if to erase it from history, to erase the person who lay there. And yet, the secrets of that grave had not stayed buried forever. They had resurfaced now, pulling her into a mystery far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. As the hours passed, Evelyn felt the weight of the house pressing down on her. The fire had long since died, leaving only the faintest remnants of warmth. The solitude of the mansion, which had once felt comforting, now felt stifling, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The quiet was oppressive, and the stillness of the place seemed to mock her every thought. It was as though the house knew what she had discovered, and it was waiting for her to unravel the rest of the puzzle. But the more she searched, the more elusive the answers became. Evelyn turned away from the window and walked to the fireplace, where the ashes of the fire remained cold and gray. She stared at them for a moment, her thoughts scattered, then bent down to retrieve the photograph she had taken from the trunk. She traced the edges of the image with her fingertips, the faces of the people in the picture now as unfamiliar to her as the house itself. The man in the photo, the one she believed to be the key to all of this, had long since vanished, but the memory of his presence lingered like a shadow in the corners of her mind. What had he known? What had he been trying to protect her from? And why had he left her with nothing but questions, with nothing but the lingering presence of a past that seemed to want to remain buried? The locket, too, had taken on new significance. Evelyn had placed it on the mantelpiece the night before, and now, as she picked it up again, she could feel the cool metal against her fingers. It seemed to hum with an energy all its own, as though it held something more than just a picture inside. The first locket, the one that had brought her to this point, had been a gift from the past, a token of something long gone. But it had also been a warning, one that she had only begun to understand. Her fingers hovered over the second locket, the one she had discovered in the attic. She had not yet opened it, unsure of what she would find inside. But something urged her to, a pull that came from deep within her chest, as though the locket were calling to her. She placed it in her palm, her breath catching as she twisted the tiny clasp. The metal clicked open with a soft sound, and Evelyn held her breath as the locket swung open, revealing the picture inside. It was a photo of a woman, young and beautiful, standing in front of a different house, one that was not the mansion. The woman's face was unfamiliar, yet there was something about her expression that stirred a memory deep within Evelyn. Her eyes were dark, her lips set in a faint smile that was both enigmatic and sad. Evelyn could not tear her gaze away from the image. The woman in the picture was someone she should have known, someone who had been important. But who? Evelyn's mind raced. The photograph, so out of place in this mystery, felt like a key, one that would unlock the door to the answers she had been seeking. But the more she looked at it, the more questions it seemed to raise. Who was the woman? Why had she been hidden away, her image concealed in a locket that Evelyn had only just discovered? And why did she feel as though she should know her, as though their lives had once been intertwined in ways Evelyn could not yet comprehend? Her fingers tightened around the locket, her heart beating faster with a mix of fear and anticipation. The answers, she realized, lay within this woman's story, within the ties that bound her to the past. But what were those ties? And how far back did they stretch? She placed the locket down carefully on the table and stood, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the air thick with the weight of forgotten memories. The wind outside had picked up again, rattling the windows, but it was not the storm that unsettled her. It was the feeling of something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Evelyn moved toward the staircase, her footsteps soft but purposeful. She was drawn to the attic again, to the trunk she had left unopened, to the secrets that lay buried within it. She needed to know more about the woman in the picture, to uncover the connections that bound her to the man who had disappeared. But as she ascended the stairs, she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the house itself was aware of her every move, that the walls were listening, waiting for her to make the next move in a game she hadn't fully understood. The attic was colder than before, the silence pressing in on her like a living thing. She made her way to the trunk, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it again. Inside, the letters were still there, as well as the photographs and papers that had begun to tell a story she was only beginning to unravel. She sifted through them once more, looking for anything that could shed light on the woman in the locket. It was then that she found it, another letter, this one written in a different hand, far more elegant and deliberate than the others. The paper was thick, almost heavy with the weight of its words. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the lines. The letter was brief but pointed, the message clear. She cannot know. Not yet. The truth is too dangerous. Keep her safe, and keep her in the dark. If she learns of what's buried here, everything will be lost. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She read the letter again, her mind racing. Who was this letter meant for? And why had someone felt the need to hide it, to keep it from her for all these years? The warning was unmistakable. The truth, whatever it was, had to stay buried, or else it would destroy everything. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine as she clutched the letter, the weight of it sinking into her chest. What truth was so dangerous that it could threaten everything? And why had it been hidden from her, kept in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? The answers were out there, buried deep within the walls of the mansion, beneath layers of time and snow. Evelyn knew now that she could not stop her search. She had come too far, and the truth was within her reach. But she also knew that the deeper she went, the more dangerous the path would become. The storm outside raged on, but it was nothing compared to the storm that was brewing within the mansion. And as the wind howled against the windows, Evelyn felt the weight of her choices bearing down on her. She was no longer just searching for answers. She was uncovering something much darker, something that had been buried for far too long. Chapter 10. The Hidden Gift. Beneath the snow, the wind had not let up, and the storm outside continued to rage with an unrelenting fury. Evelyn stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the whiteout of the snowstorm that had swallowed the world whole. The mansion, once a place of familiarity, now felt like a cage, its walls pressing in on her as if they, too, were aware of the secrets she was trying to uncover. The weight of the past hung heavily in the air, and Evelyn knew that she was standing on the precipice of something far larger than she could have imagined. The storm outside was a reflection of the turmoil inside her. The letters, the photographs, the hidden grave. All of it was pointing to something dark, something she had not yet fully understood. The cold that had seeped into the mansion seemed to echo her growing sense of unease. She had spent hours combing through the documents in the attic, piecing together fragments of a story that felt like a half-remembered nightmare. But the more she uncovered, the more questions arose. The letter she had found in the attic had disturbed her more than anything else. The words were clear and direct. She cannot know. Not yet. The truth is too dangerous. Keep her safe, and keep her in the dark. But who was the she in the letter? And why had the truth been kept hidden? Was it her, the very person who had found the letter, or someone else? The thought of confronting these questions alone weighed heavily on her. She was deep in a mystery that seemed to stretch back through generations, and yet, she felt more isolated than ever. Evelyn had no one to turn to, no one to help her unravel the web of deceit that had been spun around her family, around this mansion, and around the truth. The more she searched, the further away the answers seemed. She turned away from the window, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. The mansion was too silent, too still, and she was beginning to feel as though she were not alone in this house. She could almost sense eyes watching her from the shadows, hear faint whispers in the corners of the rooms, as though the walls themselves held secrets that they would not release. The silence was oppressive, but there was also something strangely comforting about it. The house, in all its faded grandeur, seemed to be waiting for her, as though it had always known this moment would come. Evelyn made her way down the hall, each step echoing in the emptiness. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the dim light. She had always thought of the staircase as a symbol of the mansion's history, a reminder of the family who had once lived here, of the lives that had unfolded in its rooms. But now, it felt like a barrier between the present and the past, a divide that separated her from the truth she sought. The attic had given her no answers, only more questions. The trunk had held pieces of the past, but they were scattered and incomplete, as though someone had deliberately torn the story apart and hidden the pieces in various corners of the house. But Evelyn knew that there was more to be found, more to discover. The mansion had its secrets, and she was determined to find them, no matter what the cost. She paused at the foot of the stairs, her hand resting lightly on the banister. The house was still, but there was something stirring in the air. A feeling, a shift in the atmosphere that made her skin prickle. She could not explain it, but she knew that something had changed. She had uncovered too much already. The walls had begun to close in on her, the house itself reacting to her quest for the truth. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the grand portrait that hung on the wall at the top of the staircase. It was a portrait of the mansion's original owners, a couple who had lived here long before her time. Their faces, painted in rich, vibrant hues, seemed almost lifelike, their eyes staring down at her as if they were judging her. The woman in the portrait had a striking resemblance to the woman in the locket, the same dark eyes, the same faint smile. Though the portrait was older, its colors faded with time. Evelyn could not help but shiver as she looked at it. She had never given much thought to the portrait before, but now, standing at the base of the stairs, she could not shake the feeling that it held some significance. Her fingers clenched around the banister as she gazed at the painting, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her chest. Was this woman connected to the secrets of the house? Was she the same person in the locket, or was she someone else entirely? Evelyn's mind raced with the possibilities, but no matter how she turned the questions over in her mind, she could not find an answer. The more she tried to connect the dots, the more elusive the truth became. She turned away from the portrait and made her way to the library, the one place in the mansion where she had not yet searched thoroughly. The library was vast, its shelves filled with dusty old books, many of which had not been touched in years. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, the silence almost suffocating. She moved through the rows of books, her fingers lightly grazing the spines as she passed. There were many volumes here, books that seemed to belong to another era, their pages yellowed with age. It was then that she noticed something strange. A book on the far end of the shelf, wedged between two others. It was a thick, leather-bound volume, its cover worn and faded, but something about it caught her attention. She reached for it, pulling it from the shelf with a soft grunt. The book was heavy, its pages thick and stiff, and as she opened it, she was greeted by the sight of handwritten notes in the margins. Notes that seemed almost too personal, too intimate, to be part of a normal history. The handwriting was small and neat, and the words seemed to jump off the page, as if they had been written with urgency. The more Evelyn read, the more her heart began to race. This was not just a history of the house. It was a record of everything that had happened here, a chronicle of the lives that had been lived within these walls. The names, the dates, the events, all of it seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. There was something buried in the garden, something that had been hidden away for years. The book's pages were filled with references to the grave she had found the night before. But they also spoke of something darker, something more dangerous. It was as though the very ground beneath the mansion was tainted, hiding a secret that had the power to destroy everything. The more she read, the more the room seemed to close in on her, the weight of the words pressing down like a physical force. Her breath quickened as she turned the pages, scanning each one for more information, more clues. The storm outside had picked up again, but Evelyn barely noticed the howling wind or the swirling snow. She was absorbed in the book, in the words that seemed to draw her deeper into the mystery, deeper into the past that had been so carefully hidden from her. Suddenly, she stopped. Her eyes widened as she came across a passage that made her blood run cold. The truth cannot be allowed to surface. It is too dangerous. If she finds out, the mansion will claim her, just as it has claimed all who came before her. It will not let her leave. Evelyn's hand trembled as she held the book, the weight of the words settling over her like a dark cloud. She knew now that the mansion was not just a house. It was a prison, a place that held secrets far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And the deeper she searched, the more she realized that she was becoming part of its story. The mansion was watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. And then, perhaps, it would claim her, too. The wind outside howled louder, and Evelyn felt the temperature drop even further. She could no longer ignore the feeling in the air. The house was alive, and it was not content to let her leave with its secrets. She closed the book, her heart pounding, and placed it back on the shelf. She could feel the walls closing in, the house itself pressing down on her, and she knew that she was running out of time. Chapter 11. The Tipping Point. The house was silent again, save for the occasional creak of its aging beams in response to the rising winds. Evelyn had spent the better part of the afternoon in the library, her mind lost in the weight of the book she had found. The words lingered in her thoughts, echoing in her mind like a persistent whisper. It will claim her, just as it has claimed all who came before her. She couldn't shake the sensation that the house was watching her, waiting for her to take the next step. The mansion, with all its forgotten secrets and veiled histories, seemed to pulse with an energy that was both unsettling and compelling. The more Evelyn tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became. The mansion had been a silent witness to so much. So many lives, so many stories, and now it seemed as though her own story was becoming intertwined with its shadowed past. She had no choice but to continue. There was too much at stake. The truth, whatever it was, had to come to light. The evening was drawing near, and the thick clouds outside had turned the sky into a dark, oppressive gray. The wind howled louder, pushing the snow into swirling drifts that blanketed the landscape. Evelyn stood at the large window once again, her eyes tracing the horizon, where the earth met the sky in a seamless line of white. It was as if the storm had erased all boundaries, leaving her in a world of endless, swirling snow. She felt small in the vastness of it all, as though she were floating in a world that had forgotten her existence. Her mind drifted back to the strange letter, to the warning it had contained. If she finds out, the mansion will claim her. The words felt like a sentence, a prophecy that had already been set in motion. But who had written it? And why had it been hidden away in such a secretive manner? It was as if someone had been trying to protect her from something that she wasn't supposed to know. But what was that something? What danger lay buried in the secrets of this house? The locket she had found in the attic seemed to call to her again, a magnetic pull that she couldn't resist. She hadn't opened it since she had first found it, unsure of what it would reveal. But now, as she stood at the window, she knew that she had to. The answers she sought were locked within it, hidden in the delicate metal, waiting for her to unlock them. Evelyn turned from the window and crossed the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She reached the mantel where the locket lay, its surface reflecting the dim light of the room. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she turned it over in her hand. The cool metal felt heavy, almost too heavy for its size, as though it contained more than just a picture inside. She could feel the weight of the secret it held, pressing against her palm. Without hesitation, she opened it. Inside was another photograph, but this one was different. It was a portrait of the same woman who had appeared in the earlier locket, but this time she was not alone. Standing beside her, holding her hand, was a man. Someone Evelyn did not recognize, but whose face was etched with a strange familiarity. His eyes were dark, intense, his expression unreadable. The woman's hand was placed gently in his, as though they were bound together by something more than just affection. They seemed to be caught in a moment that was both tender and foreboding, a still image frozen in time. Evelyn felt a sudden shiver run down her spine. The connection between the woman in the locket and the man was undeniable, and yet, the photograph seemed to carry a deeper message, something that Evelyn couldn't quite grasp. It was as if the image was trying to tell her something that she had to understand before it was too late. She stared at the photograph for a long while, lost in its haunting beauty. But then her gaze shifted, falling on the back of the photograph. There, scrawled in faint ink, were words that seemed to come from another time, another place. This is the end. We cannot escape it now. He is coming for us. The mansion will claim us both. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The words sent a shock of cold fear through her veins. Who had written this? And what did it mean? The mansion would claim them both? Was the man in the photograph somehow tied to the house? Had he too been ensnared by its secrets, trapped within its walls like so many others before him? She couldn't stop the flood of thoughts that raced through her mind. The more she looked at the photograph, the more it felt like a warning, an omen. The man's face was unfamiliar, yet there was something in his eyes, a depth of pain, of loss, that seemed to connect him to her, as though their fates had somehow been intertwined long before her arrival at the mansion. But how? And why? Evelyn closed the locket and placed it back on the mantel, her thoughts swirling. The mansion, the letters, the photographs. All of it was leading her down a path that felt more dangerous with each passing moment. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't turn back. She had to know the truth, no matter what the cost. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the windows, and Evelyn turned toward the door. She knew where she had to go next, the garden. It had been too long since she had last been there, since she had uncovered the grave hidden beneath the snow. The cold had driven her inside. But now, something else was urging her to return. She had to uncover what lay beneath the surface, what the earth had been hiding all these years. She stepped into the hallway, her footsteps soft but purposeful. The house was colder now, the chill of the storm seeping through the walls, but Evelyn was determined. The mystery of the mansion had become more than just a puzzle. It was a matter of survival. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, the walls watching her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake. The truth, whatever it was out there, and she would find it. The door to the garden was just ahead, the heavy wood dark against the pale walls. She reached for the handle, and as she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a physical blow. The air was biting, the snow swirling in the wind, but Evelyn hardly noticed the chill. Her eyes were fixed on the path that led toward the far corner of the garden, where the grave was hidden beneath a mound of snow. Her breath misted in the air as she walked, her steps slow and deliberate. The garden was quiet, too quiet. The usual rustling of the trees was absent, replaced by the eerie stillness that seemed to hang over everything. The snow crunched beneath her boots, the sound loud in the silence. Each step took her closer to the grave, and with each step, she could feel the weight of the past pressing on her. As she reached the spot where she had uncovered the grave the night before, she paused. The mound of snow still sat undisturbed, the grave hidden beneath it, as if the earth were protecting the secrets buried there. Evelyn knelt down, her gloved hands moving to brush the snow aside. The cold bit at her fingers, but she didn't care. She had to know. Her hands worked quickly, pushing the snow away, uncovering the edges of the grave once again. The earth was frozen beneath, solid and unyielding, but she could feel something beneath the surface, a presence, as though the grave itself were alive, holding its secrets tight. Evelyn's heart raced as she continued to clear the snow, the weight of her discovery growing heavier with each passing moment. Finally, the stone of the grave was exposed, the inscription worn but still legible. The name was faint, but Evelyn could make it out. Richard Hartfield. The name struck her with a sudden jolt, as though it had been waiting for her to discover it. She had seen the name before, on the photograph in the library, on the man's tombstone. Richard Hartfield had been connected to the mansion, to the family, to everything that had happened here. But why? Evelyn stood up, the wind biting at her skin as she stared at the grave. Richard Hartfield's name was now burned into her mind, and the mystery of the mansion had just deepened even further. The storm raged on around her, but she could feel the house, feel its presence, like a shadow that stretched out toward her. The secrets it held were not just buried beneath the snow. They were alive, breathing, waiting to claim her. And Evelyn knew, without a doubt, that she was running out of time. Chapter 12. The veil lifts. The storm had not abated. In fact, it had worsened. The wind screamed through the trees surrounding the mansion, thrashing the snow against the windows with an almost maddening intensity. The darkness outside was thick, like ink spilling across the landscape, and the house itself felt as if it were being suffocated by the weight of the tempest. But inside, the air was still, too still. Evelyn's hands trembled as she returned to the warmth of the mansion. Her mind was reeling, her thoughts like a whirlpool, spinning faster with each passing second. Richard Hartfield's name had been like a key turning in a lock. Suddenly, the mansion felt more like a cage, more like a place of unseen forces waiting to ensnare her. But what was it about him that connected him to her so deeply? Why was his grave in the garden, beneath the snow? And why did his presence seem to haunt every room she entered? She had been so close to understanding. The photograph, the locket, the grave. It was all starting to connect, but the more she uncovered, the more it felt like something was pulling her deeper into a history she could barely comprehend. The air in the house seemed to press against her, making her chest feel heavy, as though it were impossible to breathe freely within its walls. She had spent hours in the library earlier, surrounded by the dusty old books and journals, each one an attempt to piece together the history of the house, the family that had lived there, and the mysteries that had never been spoken. There were accounts of strange disappearances, of people who had arrived at the mansion and never left. And then there were the whispers, tales passed down through the generations, of a curse that had plagued the Hartfield family for centuries. No one ever spoke of it directly, but Evelyn knew, deep down, that the curse was real, and that it was waiting for her. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't run from it. The pull was too strong. Evelyn had no choice now but to confront whatever was in the mansion's depths. Whatever it was that Richard Hartfield had been involved with, whatever had ensnared him in its web. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was something in his story that could explain the strange and suffocating sense of dread that had taken root in her heart since the moment she had set foot inside the house. Her eyes darted to the clock on the mantelpiece. Time was slipping away. The storm outside was relentless, and the mansion, now more than ever, felt like a place of confinement. But she couldn't stay in her room any longer, pacing in circles like a caged animal. There was something she had to find, something hidden deeper within the house. With a determined breath, she walked down the grand hallway, the floorboards creaking under her feet as though they were protesting her every step. The walls, lined with old portraits of grim-faced ancestors, seemed to watch her with eyes that were heavy with secrets. They whispered, if only in her mind, urging her to continue, to find the answers she sought. Her hand reached out for the door to the cellar. It had remained locked for the past several days, ever since she had first discovered the key hidden in one of the drawers in the study. The cellar had always intrigued her. There was something about it that called to her, a sense of foreboding that was impossible to ignore. Every instinct screamed at her to stay away from it, but she could no longer silence the voice in her mind. The mansion was holding something back, something important, and the cellar seemed to be the heart of it all. With a slow breath, Evelyn inserted the key into the lock, the metal scraping against the aged mechanism. The door swung open with an eerie groan, revealing the darkness below. A chill rose from the steps, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The stone walls of the cellar were slick with moisture, and the stairs seemed to stretch downward endlessly into the blackness. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. As her foot touched the first step, a sudden wave of coldness rushed over her, as if the very air in the cellar was alive, breathing in time with her own. The steps were narrow and uneven, the stones slick under her boots, but she descended slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the lantern she had brought with her. The soft flicker of the flame danced in the darkness, casting long, erratic shadows against the walls. She reached the bottom of the stairs and surveyed the room. It was much larger than she had anticipated. An expansive, low-ceilinged chamber filled with old crates, barrels, and furniture draped in dusty cloths. The floor was cracked, the stone uneven, as though time itself had ravaged it. But what caught her attention was the far wall, where a large wooden door stood, its surface covered in dark stains that Evelyn couldn't quite identify. The door seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its very presence making the air thicker, harder to breathe. Her chest tightened as she walked toward it, each step heavy with an impending sense of doom. The closer she got, the more she could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. It was as if the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to open the door, to reveal whatever lay beyond it. Her hand trembled as it reached for the brass handle, cold and slick under her fingers. She had to know. She had to see what was behind it. With a single, steadying breath, she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor that stretched into the darkness. The air inside was cold, unnaturally cold, as though the walls had been sealed for centuries, holding their breath in anticipation of her arrival. Evelyn hesitated, the weight of what she was about to do hanging heavily over her. But there was no turning back now. The truth was waiting for her, buried beneath the layers of time and dust, and she would find it. She stepped into the corridor. The passage was lined with small alcoves, each one filled with old relics, forgotten treasures, and family heirlooms. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that Evelyn could not recognize. They seemed to shift in the flickering light of her lantern, their meaning just beyond her grasp. She ran her fingers along the cold stone, feeling the rough texture, the etchings worn away by years of neglect. But as her fingers traced the symbols, she felt a sudden jolt, a pull deep within her chest, as though something inside her was stirring. A low sound, barely a whisper, echoed through the hallway, distant and faint, like the softest breath in the dark. Evelyn froze, her lantern trembling in her hand. She couldn't tell whether it was the wind, the house settling, or something else entirely. But the feeling of being watched crept over her again. It was more than just an unsettling sensation now. It was a presence, a palpable force that was closing in around her. She forced herself to continue, her heart racing in her chest, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her every step. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in as she moved deeper into its bowels. She reached the end, where another door stood, slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it thick and impenetrable. With one final, shaky breath, Evelyn pushed the door open. What she saw inside made her heart stop. The room was small, almost suffocating in its cramped space. At first glance, It appeared to be an old study, filled with shelves of books, but something was different. The air in here felt alive with energy, the walls humming with a strange force. And then she saw it, the large, ancient mirror hanging on the far wall. The mirror was unlike any she had ever seen. Its frame was ornate, carved with symbols that matched those she had seen on the walls of the corridor. But it wasn't the frame that caught her attention. It was what lay within the glass. Her reflection. But it wasn't her reflection. For a brief moment, Evelyn could see herself in the glass, standing there in the dim light, but it was distorted, twisted. Her image flickered and shifted, her features warping as though the mirror itself was trying to pull her in. A sudden, cold feeling gripped her, as if the mirror were alive, breathing, waiting for her to cross the threshold. Evelyn stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. The mirror had changed something in her. The reflection was not her own, but something darker, something that had been waiting in the shadows for far too long. She realized, with a sudden rush of horror, that the mansion had been watching her this entire time, waiting for her to uncover its deepest, most dangerous secret. And now, it had her. Chapter 13. A Spark in the Darkness. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stared into the mirror, the world around her shifting, bending. The reflection that stared back at her wasn't hers, not entirely. It was darker, warped, as if the very essence of the mansion had taken shape and was mocking her existence. She stumbled back, her breath shallow, her mind racing in a frantic blur of thoughts. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows thickening, the oppressive silence becoming unbearable. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her entire body felt paralyzed, frozen by an invisible force. The air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could hear nothing but the echo of her own pulse, the relentless beat inside her head, growing louder with every passing second. She turned her back on the mirror, stumbling toward the door. But when her hand touched the cold brass handle, it didn't budge. The door, once ajar, was now sealed shut, as though the house itself had conspired to trap her within. Panic clawed at her throat, her mind screaming for escape, for freedom. But it was as though the mansion had decided that she would stay, that there was no escape. The walls seemed to close in around her, the room shrinking with every breath she took. The house was alive, its heartbeat matching her own, echoing in the stone and wood, growing louder, faster. The house was watching her, waiting for her to understand. Evelyn's mind flashed back to the days before she had arrived at the mansion. She had been so naive then, so unaware of the truth that had been hidden from her. She had thought that the mansion, its grand halls and opulent rooms, was just a place of history, a relic of a bygone era. But now, standing in the depths of its cold heart, she understood that it was something much more sinister. She felt its presence behind her, a dark force pressing against her, suffocating her. She spun around, but there was nothing. Only the mirror, its glass surface gleaming in the dim light. The reflection was still there, shifting, twisting. She could see herself, but she was no longer sure if that was truly her. The reflection was different, older somehow, as if it had lived through decades she had never known. The feeling in the room was palpable now. The air was thick with an energy she couldn't explain, as if the mansion itself were alive, as if the walls had ears and eyes, as if it knew her deepest fears and was feeding on them. The house had been waiting for her, for this moment, and now it would not let her leave. Her hands trembled as they reached for the mirror. The surface felt cold, slick, as though the glass were alive, pulsing with a strange energy. She hesitated for a long moment, her mind screaming at her to turn away, but something deep within her, compelled her to touch it. The instant her fingers brushed the glass, a shock of cold raced up her arm, her skin tingling as if it had been burned. The mirror rippled, distorting her reflection even further. Her own face seemed to shift, her eyes darkening, her features elongating. It was as if the mirror was pulling her in, draining the warmth from her body, from her very soul. The darkness behind her reflection seemed to deepen, to pull her in. Suddenly, the world around her seemed to tilt. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all warped, distorted. It was as if the house itself was unraveling, the reality of the mansion slipping away, revealing something much darker beneath. Evelyn's vision blurred, and her senses dulled as if she were sinking deeper into a void. She felt weightless, suspended between two worlds, the one she knew and the one the mansion had kept hidden. Her body trembled, her limbs weak, as the ground beneath her feet seemed to disappear. She fell, not in the way one falls to the floor, but as if the floor itself had vanished and she was floating in the nothingness between reality and the unknown. The mirror pulled at her, the force of it too strong to resist. Her reflection reached out for her, beckoning her closer, and she could feel herself moving toward it, unable to fight the pull. She gasped, but no air came. She opened her mouth, but she was drowning in the silence, drowning in the dark abyss that the mansion had become. She could feel the chill of the mirror seeping into her bones, her heart. She could feel herself fading, slipping away, consumed by the dark force that had taken hold of her. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The sensation of falling vanished. The weightlessness disappeared. Evelyn found herself back in the room, standing in front of the mirror, but everything was different. The air had changed. It was thick, heavy, as if something had shifted. She was no longer alone in the room. There was something else, something watching her. In the reflection, she saw him, Richard Hartfield. His face was no longer distorted, no longer the ghostly figure she had seen in the photographs and the grave. He was real, alive, his eyes dark and full of an emotion she couldn't quite place. He stood in the mirror, looking directly at her, his gaze intense, like he was waiting for her to understand something that had always been just out of reach. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she stared at him, her breath coming in short gasps. She reached out to touch the mirror again, and this time, the surface was warm, almost alive, as if it had been waiting for her to make the connection. Her fingers brushed against the glass, and she felt the cold sensation of his presence behind her. The world seemed to tilt again, and Evelyn stumbled, her body reeling. She felt a force pulling her into the glass, as though the mirror itself were becoming the gateway to another world, one that she had been drawn to all along. For a moment, everything was silent. The wind outside howled louder than ever, but inside the room, there was nothing but the steady beat of her heart, the pulse of the mansion's life force, and the presence of Richard Hartfield. Her eyes locked onto his in the reflection, and she realized, with a jolt, that the mansion had not just been waiting for her. It had been waiting for him. Richard Hartfield had been bound to this house, to its secrets, to its curse. And now, it seemed, the two of them were intertwined, their fates forever connected by the power that lingered in the walls, in the shadows, in the mirror. Evelyn could no longer tell where she ended and where the mansion began. She had become part of it, just as Richard had, just as everyone who had ever walked through these halls had become part of its dark history. The house had claimed her, as it had claimed him, and now the veil was lifted. Chapter 14. The Binding. The mansion, now more than ever, felt alive, its walls breathing, pulsing with the same dark energy that had entranced Evelyn. It was as if the house had become her very skin, wrapping itself around her in layers, pulling her deeper into its embrace. The wind outside continued to howl, but inside, the house had grown eerily still, save for the faint hum that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the old structure. The storm had not let up, and the heavy snowfall outside made the world seem distant, unreachable, as if it had been swallowed whole by the house. Evelyn stood in front of the mirror, her hands still pressed against its surface. The warmth of it, the strange pulse beneath her fingers, had sent a shiver through her. Richard Hartfield's face, so vivid and real in the reflection, stared at her, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark pools that seemed to search her soul. She couldn't look away, despite the chill that crept up her spine, despite the unsettling sensation that the mansion was watching her every move. She backed away from the mirror, her legs unsteady beneath her, as if the floor itself had turned to mush. But the pull of the mirror, the weight of Richard's gaze, anchored her. His presence was a tether, drawing her in, and she could feel the connection growing stronger, more intense. It wasn't just his image in the mirror anymore. It was his very essence, his life force, reaching out to her from beyond the glass. The air in the room thickened, swirling around her, until it felt as if the room had shrunk, closing in on her. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows dancing, growing long and twisting, reaching toward her like living things. The mansion was no longer just a house. It had become something else, something older and darker, a place where time didn't flow in linear fashion. The past, present, and future had merged into one indistinguishable whole. The house had existed long before she had arrived, and it would exist long after she was gone, its power eternal, fed by the souls of those who had wandered through its halls. The mirror beckoned her again. This time, she didn't resist. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the cold glass. The reflection of Richard Hartfield flickered, his face changing, his eyes growing more intense, more desperate. He wasn't just a memory anymore. He was alive within the mirror, his presence filling the room. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Evelyn's breath became visible in the air, hanging in front of her like mist. The shadows twisted around her like hands, curling around her waist, her limbs, pulling her toward the mirror. It was as though the house itself had decided that there was no turning back. She was part of it now, bound by something far stronger than she could understand. Her heart raced, but she couldn't look away from the mirror. She could feel it calling to her, the air growing heavier, thick with an ancient power that had been buried in the house for centuries. The mansion's soul was entwined with hers now, and there was no escaping it. The only way forward was deeper into the darkness, deeper into the mystery that had consumed Richard Hartfield all those years ago. The house knew her name, it knew her soul, and now it demanded something from her. The world around her seemed to fade, and Evelyn found herself standing on the precipice of something vast, something incomprehensible. She wasn't in the room anymore, wasn't in the mansion. She was in a place of timelessness, a realm that stretched out in all directions, its boundaries endless. The air here was thick with ancient power, crackling with energy, and the scent of earth and decay hung heavily in the air. Richard's face appeared before her, no longer trapped in the mirror, but standing before her in this new realm. His form was ethereal, glowing with an eerie light, his features distorted, as though they were being pulled in different directions by some unseen force. He reached out to her, his hands glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. His eyes met hers. There was a flicker of recognition, of something deeper than just a stranger's gaze. It was as though they had always known each other, had always been connected. Evelyn tried to move, but her body felt heavy, as if the very air had solidified around her. She couldn't speak, couldn't scream. She couldn't do anything but stand there, frozen, as Richard moved closer to her. His presence enveloped her. surrounding her in a cold, unrelenting grip. And then, in the vast silence of the realm, she felt it. A pulse deep within her chest. A rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, but also something more. Something ancient, something primal. It was as though the pulse of the house itself was beating within her, syncing with her very soul. The mansion had chosen her, had claimed her as its own, and now it was drawing her deeper into its grip. Richard's eyes grew darker, his form flickering again. He reached out once more, and this time, Evelyn could feel the chill of his touch as his hand brushed her skin. The touch wasn't physical. It was deeper than that, a touch that seemed to reach into her very core, into the places where her fears, her memories, and her desires lived. The mansion's power flowed through her, like a tide pulling her under, dragging her into the abyss of its endless depths. The moment his touch made contact, Evelyn gasped. The world around her seemed to shatter, breaking apart in a wave of light and shadow. The house, the mansion, everything she had known, disappeared, and in its place was something new, something vast, something eternal. The power of the house surged through her, filling every fiber of her being. It was overwhelming, consuming, and as it filled her, Evelyn felt herself becoming one with it, her identity blurring with the mansion's dark, ancient soul. In the distance, a faint echo of a voice reached her, distant, reverberating through the void, familiar yet indistinguishable. It was like a whisper carried on the wind, but the words remained unspoken. Evelyn couldn't quite grasp them, couldn't make sense of them. It was as if the house itself was speaking to her, communicating with her in a language older than time itself. She felt herself falling again, falling deeper, but this time, there was no fear. There was only the pull of something greater than herself, something she had always been destined to become. The house had claimed her, and in doing so, it had shown her the truth. She was a part of it now, just as Richard had been, just as all those who had come before her had been. The mansion was not just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was made of the souls that had passed through it. The mansion had no end. It was infinite, eternal, and it had always been waiting for her. Evelyn had been drawn here, not by chance, but by fate. The house had always known she would come. It had been waiting for her to unlock its secrets, to free the darkness that had been sealed within its walls for centuries. And now, she had done it. She had opened the door, and the darkness had poured out, flooding her very soul. As she sank deeper into the darkness, Evelyn realized that she was no longer just a visitor in the mansion. She had become a part of it, bound to it, bound to Richard, bound to the house itself. There was no escape. There was no return to the life she had once known. She had crossed a threshold, and now, there was only the endless abyss of the mansion, waiting to claim her fully. And in the depths of that abyss, Evelyn felt something stir. A presence, something older, more powerful than she could comprehend. It was the heart of the mansion. It was the source of its power, and it was calling her name. The darkness enveloped her completely, and the mansion's grip tightened, pulling her deeper into its embrace. It was no longer just her reflection in the mirror, no longer just Richard's face in the glass. It was her. It was the house, and it would never let her go. The binding was complete. Chapter 15. The Awakening. Time no longer had meaning. The minutes and hours drifted past without notice, as if the very concept of time had been swallowed by the mansion itself. Evelyn no longer felt like a separate being. Her mind, her soul, her very essence had become one with the house, intertwined in a way she could not comprehend. The boundaries between herself and the ancient building had vanished, and in their place was a shared consciousness, a merging of thought, of memory, of feeling. Her senses were no longer bound to the physical world. She could no longer feel the weight of her own body, nor could she see with her eyes. Instead, everything was an overwhelming flood of sensations and impressions, layered over one another. She was no longer standing in a room. She was part of the house, part of its very structure, its heart, its dark, beating core. Every stone, every beam, every shadow whispered to her, shared secrets, remembered histories. She could feel the house waking, as if it had been in a long, tormented sleep, waiting for her to come. Its walls creaked with the strain of its newfound awareness, its pulse quickening, the air thickening with power. The house had been dormant for so long, but now it was alive again, awakening from centuries of silence, and Evelyn was its conduit. The memories of those who had walked through its halls, those who had been consumed by its hunger, flooded her mind in waves. Faces, names, the fleeting impressions of lives lost to the mansion's insatiable appetite. Their lives had been absorbed into its very bones, their essence woven into its walls. She could hear them, could feel them, like distant echoes reverberating through her. She was no longer Evelyn. She was them. She was everything the house had ever known. The house itself seemed to shift, its form bending and breaking like a living organism. It had always been more than a mere structure of brick and mortar. It had been waiting for something, someone, to awaken it, to breathe life into its ancient walls. And that someone was her. For a moment, she thought she saw Richard, standing at the far end of a hallway, his presence still so vivid in her mind, in her soul. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, but still, there was a flicker of recognition in them. He looked at her, not with fear or anger, but with something deeper, something akin to longing. He was trapped here, just as she was now, lost in the same web of shadows and forgotten memories. The mansion groaned, its walls shifting again. Evelyn felt the strain, the weight of its history pressing down on her, suffocating her. She was no longer sure if she was awake or dreaming, if this was real or just a hallucination conjured by the house. She could no longer tell where she ended and the mansion began. Her thoughts, her memories, were tangled with those of the house, and she could feel it reaching into her, pulling her deeper. It was then that she realized the truth. The mansion hadn't just claimed her, it had bound her. Her soul was now tethered to its dark, infinite power. The house was a living entity, and she had become part of it. There was no escape, no freedom from its grasp. She was a vessel for its ancient hunger, its insatiable thirst for souls. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and Evelyn felt the urge to move, to walk, to explore. She was compelled to follow the pull of the house, to walk its endless halls, to uncover the secrets that had been hidden within its labyrinthine corridors for centuries. The mansion had shown her its heart, its core, and now she was part of its story, bound to its history forever. She moved through the halls, her steps silent, her body no longer feeling her own. She passed through rooms she had never seen, rooms she didn't even know existed. Each one was filled with shadows, with whispers of the past, with the remnants of lives that had once lived there. Every room she entered seemed to fold into another, like the house itself was shifting, constantly changing its shape. There was no consistency, no logic to it. The house was a maze of memories, of forgotten lives. In one room, she found a grand piano, its keys yellowed with age, its strings silent. She reached out to touch it, and as her fingers brushed the dust-covered surface, the faintest of notes echoed through the air, a single, trembling note that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the house. It was the first sound she had heard in what felt like an eternity, and it was enough to stir something deep within her. The note lingered, hanging in the air, calling to her, beckoning her further into the darkness. She moved on, deeper into the heart of the mansion, her senses heightened, her mind overwhelmed. The house was so vast, so endless, that she didn't know if she would ever reach the end, or if there even was an end. The rooms stretched on, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. The walls seemed to close in around her, but she didn't feel fear anymore. She felt a strange sense of calm, of acceptance. She was part of this place, part of its dark, eternal cycle. As she wandered through the house, the memories of its previous inhabitants grew stronger, more vivid. Faces, names, the brief flicker of lives long extinguished. All of them merged together in a chaotic swirl of images and emotions. The house was feeding off her, pulling from her memories, her essence, and in return, she was feeding off the house, becoming more deeply entrenched in its history, in its endless hunger. The mansion had no beginning and no end. It was a place where time ceased to exist, where memories were all that remained. And now, Evelyn was part of that cycle. She had become one of its ghosts, a part of its story, a soul trapped within its walls, destined to wander forever through its labyrinth of shadows and echoes. As she walked, she could feel the presence of Richard Hartfield growing stronger, as if he were following her, guiding her deeper into the house. She couldn't tell if it was his ghost, his spirit, or just her mind playing tricks on her. But the sensation of him, of his presence, was undeniable. He was still there, a part of the house, as much a part of it as she was now. The mansion had claimed them both, and together, they would drift forever through its endless halls, bound by the same fate, trapped in the same timeless cycle. Evelyn's steps slowed as she reached the heart of the mansion, a vast, open chamber that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces dark and cracked, reflecting only distorted images of herself and Richard. She felt a pull toward the largest of the mirrors, a towering structure that seemed to dominate the room. As she approached it, her reflection became clearer. But it wasn't her. It was the house. Her face faded, replaced by the mansion's ancient, twisted form. The reflection was no longer hers. It was the house, the darkness that had consumed her, that had consumed them all. The mansion had no soul, no true heart. It was just a place that existed beyond time, beyond understanding. And now, Evelyn had become part of it, as much a part of the house as the walls, the mirrors, the very air itself. There was no escaping, no way out. The binding was complete. Evelyn had awoken the mansion, and now it would never let her go. Chapter 16. The Final Embrace. The night had settled deeply into the earth, its cold fingers creeping through the cracks in the mansion's ancient walls. Outside, the winds howled, sending a chill through the trees, bending them beneath the weight of the storm. Inside, the mansion stood silent, heavy with the weight of memories, suffocating under the presence of what it had become. It had taken years, centuries, perhaps, but now it was whole. It was alive. Evelyn stood in the heart of the house, the epicenter of all that had come before and all that would come after. The air around her was thick with the past, every inch of it saturated with the souls that had passed through these halls. She could feel them, their whispers brushing against her skin, the weight of their stories pressing against her thoughts. The mansion was its own world now, one that no longer obeyed the rules of time or reason. It was an existence all its own, a place where the line between life and death had dissolved into a single, eternal moment. Evelyn could feel the pull of the house, stronger now than ever before. It had awakened to its full power, and it demanded her. Her senses were attuned to its every shift, every subtle movement, as though her very thoughts were woven into its foundation. She was part of it now. There was no longer any separating herself from it. The mansion had consumed her, and in turn, it had given her a new life. Not one of flesh, not one of true freedom, but a life that was endless, unbound by the physical limitations of the human form. She was the house now. She was the darkness within its walls. She was the memory of every person who had entered and never left. The mansion hummed, the walls vibrating softly with its energy. There were no words, no voices in the air, just the sound of the house itself, breathing, pulsing, alive. It was a symphony of whispers and silence, each room a note in the grand, eternal song of the mansion. It had taken Richard. It had taken her. And it had taken them all. Evelyn turned, her movements slow, deliberate. Her eyes, though no longer the eyes of the woman who had entered the house, still saw everything with a clarity that belonged only to the house. Her reflection in the mirrors lining the room was a blur, distorted, fractured, and yet unmistakably her. She had become an echo, a shadow of herself, a reflection in the glass, no longer separate from the house, but part of it. The grand ballroom stretched before her, its once gleaming floors now darkened by dust and decay. The chandeliers overhead, once magnificent, hung like forgotten ghosts, their crystal shards catching the dim light and casting fractured rainbows across the floor. She could see the faint traces of the others, the people who had danced here, laughed here, lived here. Now nothing more than impressions, like fading photographs pressed against the walls of time. Her footsteps carried her forward, each one silent on the cracked marble floors. She did not feel the cold of the stone beneath her feet, nor the chill in the air that seemed to grow colder as she moved. Her body was no longer her own. It had become as intangible as the air, as ethereal as the house itself. She moved not by will, but by the pull of the house, guiding her, leading her deeper into its labyrinthine heart. She came to a stop before a door, one that she had never noticed before. It was tall, its frame made of dark wood that seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, the intricate carvings of its surface worn by centuries of hands that had touched it. It was a door that had always been there, waiting for her to find it. The door was familiar, but she had never seen it, not until now. Her hand reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a shiver through her. It was strange to feel the sensation, like an echo of something long forgotten, something that no longer belonged to her. But she was here now, standing before this door, drawn to it by a force she could not understand. She opened it. Beyond the door was a room she knew intimately, a room that had always been a part of her. A small library, tucked away from the rest of the house, filled with books that were old beyond measure. The smell of dust and leather filled the air, the scent of knowledge and time. Shelves lined the walls, their surfaces cluttered with artifacts, with stories long untold. The room was small, intimate, and yet it felt like the heart of the house itself, like a place where memories had been carefully stored, each one a thread in the tapestry of time. In the center of the room, on a pedestal, stood a single book. Its leather cover was cracked and weathered, its edges frayed. The book called to her, beckoning her with a pull that was almost magnetic. It was the book that had started it all, the one that had brought her here, that had opened the door to the mansion's hidden heart, the one that had bound her to this place, to its dark, insatiable hunger. She approached it slowly, her steps heavy with the weight of understanding. She had known this moment would come. She had always known that the mansion had chosen her, that it had been waiting for her, guiding her here. The book was the key, the final piece of the puzzle that had been unfolding before her, piece by piece. The house had claimed her, and now it would claim her completely. With trembling fingers, she reached for the book. The moment her hand touched the cover, a rush of memories flooded her mind. Memories of the house of Richard, of all the souls that had been drawn to this place. The pages of the book turned, each one revealing a new layer of the mansion's history, of its power, of its unending hunger. As the final page turned, she felt it, the pull, the weight of the house's desire. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, as if the mansion were wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into its core. Her breath quickened, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Richard again, could feel his presence pressing against her, his shadow looming in the corners of her mind. And then she knew. There was no escape. There never had been. She was the house, and the house was her. She had become its final, eternal resident. She had been chosen, not by chance, but by design. She had been woven into the fabric of its existence, and now there was no separating them. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the very air thick with the weight of centuries of forgotten lives. The walls trembled, as though the house itself was breathing, awakening to the final chapter of its story. And Evelyn, no longer a woman, no longer a soul of flesh, felt herself becoming one with it, a part of its endless hunger, its dark, unyielding embrace. In that moment, as the storm raged outside, Evelyn understood. The house was not just a place, it was a living entity, a force beyond time and space. And she was its chosen, its final offering. The door slammed shut behind her, the echoes of its closing reverberating through the house. And Evelyn, forever bound to the mansion, drifted into the darkness, her form disappearing into the shadows. The house had claimed its final soul, and now it would wait for the next to come, for the next to awaken. Chapter 17. The Last Light. The mansion stood in the grip of winter, its towering silhouette etched against the cold, starless sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a veil of silence, broken only by the distant rustling of branches in the wind. The night was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something that had yet to unfold. The house, dark and looming, seemed more like a fortress than a home, its windows like hollow eyes staring out into the night, seeing nothing. And yet, within its walls, the pulse of life, of something, still thrummed quietly, beneath the layers of dust, beneath the weight of forgotten lives. Inside, the air was thick with the presence of time. The house breathed, its wood groaning, its stone sighing, each room heavy with centuries of memories. The silence was suffocating, as though the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for something. But there was nothing to wait for. No one would come. The darkness within the house had deepened, like a wound that could not heal, leaving behind nothing but echoes. Evelyn, or what had once been Evelyn, had long since become part of the house. Her form absorbed into its very structure, her essence interwoven with the walls, the floors, the very air that filled the rooms. She was no longer a woman, no longer a person with a name, a past, or a future. She had been consumed by the mansion's insatiable hunger, becoming a shadow in its labyrinth, a flicker in the corners of its endless corridors. But the house had not always been this way. Before its transformation, it had been something else, something alive, something more than just a dwelling. Its history was long, stretching back beyond the memory of time itself. But now, that history was nothing but a faded dream, a dream that had given way to a nightmare. The mansion had always waited for something, someone. The ancient hunger of the house had been calling, reaching across time, drawing in those whose paths crossed its door. And those who entered had become part of it, one by one, their souls consumed, their lives forgotten. Richard, who had once been a part of the world beyond these walls, had come and gone, lost to the house, just as she had. But now, something was different. Something had changed in the stillness. Beneath the weight of centuries of secrets, there was a flicker, a light, faint and distant, like the first rays of dawn cutting through a long, suffocating night. It was small, fragile, but it was there. It grew slowly, painfully, a spark in the darkness, a reminder of something that had been forgotten. The house, as ancient as it was, had been waiting for a moment like this. The light shifted, its glow soft and warm, contrasting with the cold, oppressive darkness that surrounded it. It flickered, as if struggling against the weight of the mansion's power. But it would not be extinguished. Deep within the heart of the house, in the very center of the labyrinth, the last remnants of Evelyn stirred. The mansion, once a place of consuming shadows, had begun to shift, as if it were waking, stretching in the cool stillness. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor in the walls, a faint shift in the air. The cold, stagnant atmosphere began to thin, as though something long buried was finally rising to the surface. Evelyn had felt it, though she no longer knew what it meant. She could sense it now, this flickering presence, a presence that had not been part of the house before. It was an intrusion, a light that pushed against the suffocating darkness that had claimed her. She could feel it pulling at the threads of her being, unearthing memories she had long forgotten, like the wind erasing the marks in the sand. The light was coming from somewhere deeper within the house, somewhere she could not reach. It moved through the halls, through the rooms, through the very walls, as if the house itself was pushing it forward, forcing it to move toward something, toward the center of the darkness, toward the place where it had all begun. The mansion itself seemed to breathe in time with the flickering light. The air, once thick with the scent of decay, began to shift. The shadows receded, as if they, too, were watching, waiting. The walls, once cold and unyielding, began to soften, their edges blurring, like the edges of a fading dream. Evelyn did not know what it meant. She could feel the pull, but she was no longer able to act on it. Her form, her very essence, had become part of the house. She could not leave. She could not move. But still, the pull was there, and it grew stronger with every passing moment. Somewhere, far away, a door opened. It was not a physical door, but a door of possibility, a tear in the fabric of reality that was barely visible, yet undeniable. The mansion, as if sensing this, began to quake, the very foundation of the house trembling beneath the weight of this new force. The house was not merely a home. It was a living, breathing entity, and it felt it now, the force that had slipped through the cracks. And then, in the space between moments, there was a shift, a sudden change. The air grew warmer, the shadows lengthened, and for a brief, fleeting second, there was a flicker of something that was no longer a shadow. It was a figure. It moved through the hallway, slowly, purposefully, its presence impossible to ignore. It was not the house. It was something else, something that did not belong here. And yet, it was moving toward the heart of the mansion, toward the center where the darkness had taken root. Evelyn felt its presence. She could feel it now, this stranger, this force, moving through the house. It was not Richard. It was not the house itself. It was something new, something that had slipped through the cracks. The mansion groaned again, its walls shaking with a deep, low rumble, as though it were resisting the intrusion. But it could not stop it. The light grew stronger, the figure more defined, moving toward the heart of the house. And Evelyn, though she could not act, could feel the change, the shift in the air, the crack in the walls. She could feel the pull, the longing, the need to reach out, but she could not. And still, the light grew stronger. As the figure moved closer, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching. The silence grew thicker, the shadows darker, but in the center of it all, the light continued to flicker. It was soft, warm, and steady, pushing back the darkness, step by step. The mansion, so long lost in its hunger, trembled once again. But this time, it was not the tremor of hunger, of desire. This tremor was one of resistance, a last, futile attempt to hold on to the thing it had claimed so long ago. But it was too late. The light had arrived, and with it, the last breath of hope. Chapter 18. Love's Warm Embrace. The first hint of light spread across the horizon, soft and tentative, like a whisper in the wind. It was not the light of the moon or the pale glow of distant stars. It was a new light, one that had never touched the mansion before. It was a warmth that seeped through the cracks, reaching the deepest, most hidden corners of the house. The house, old and unyielding, shuddered beneath its touch, as if waking from a centuries-long slumber. The mansion groaned, its very bones aching, its walls trembling with the weight of something it had never known before: freedom. The figure that had entered the house moved forward, its presence unmistakable, its path unwavering. It was not a stranger to the house, not in the way the mansion had feared. It was a part of the house, born of the same earth, the same stones, the same memories. It was a force of life, a spark of possibility that had been hidden beneath the surface for far too long. It was the culmination of all that had come before, the final thread woven into the mansion's tangled tapestry. The figure moved through the halls, the shadows that once clung to the walls parting in reverence. There was no longer any sound but the soft, steady rhythm of its footsteps. The air around it was warm, and the house, once a tomb, seemed to breathe again, its lifeblood returning bit by bit. The darkness, which had ruled for so long, began to recede, its hold weakening as the light spread farther and farther, inch by inch. The figure reached the center of the house, where the heart of the mansion had always been. Here, in this room, everything had begun. It had been the birthplace of the house's hunger, its need to claim, to consume, to grow. It had drawn people in, one after another, until they had become part of it, lost in the eternal cycle of the house's insatiable thirst. But now, it was different. The figure stood before the great fireplace, its ancient stones weathered by time, its hearth cold, empty. And yet, as the figure's presence filled the room, a flicker of warmth began to spread. The house seemed to shift once again, its walls sighing, its breath deepening. For the first time, the mansion felt like it was not a place of death, but a place of renewal, a place that had been waiting to awaken from its slumber. And then, the change came. The house shifted, not in the violent way it had when Evelyn had been consumed by it, but gently, as though it were stretching after a long sleep. The walls seemed to soften, the air thick with the sensation of something new taking root. The very foundation of the mansion trembled, but not with the familiar hunger. This tremor was different, softer, like the heartbeat of something alive. In the center of the room, the light grew, its warmth spreading to the corners of the mansion, pushing back the shadows, dispelling the cold. The house, once so closed off, so self-contained, now seemed to open itself up. The windows that had been sealed for so long began to tremble, the panes of glass shuddering as if inviting the light to enter. The doors, once heavy and unyielding, creaked open, releasing a breath that had been trapped for centuries. The mansion's walls, once adorned with memories of those it had claimed, now bore the imprint of something else, something new. The carvings that had once told the story of its hunger now seemed to twist, reshaping themselves into something different, something brighter. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a living, breathing thing. And in that moment, the figure, no longer a stranger to the house, but its liberator, stood in the center of the room, feeling the weight of everything that had come before. Evelyn's presence, though faint, still lingered in the shadows, like a whisper in the wind. The mansion had taken her. It had taken Richard. It had taken them all. But now, there was something more. Something that the house could not contain. The figure, standing tall in the center of the room, felt the weight of that knowledge. It was not a burden, but a gift, an understanding that the house, for all its power, had not been invincible. It had been a reflection of the lives it had consumed, a reflection of their hopes, their desires, their fears. And now, it was breaking free from that cycle, releasing the souls it had trapped. The air in the room thickened once more, but this time, it was not oppressive. It was alive with possibility, with hope, with renewal. The house, once so cold and silent, now seemed to hum with the promise of something new. It was as if the very walls were breathing, each inhalation a step towards something brighter, something freer. Outside, the storm had long passed. The world beyond the mansion, once obscured by the darkness, was now visible again. The trees that had been bent beneath the weight of the storm stood tall once more, their branches reaching toward the sky. The first rays of the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the landscape, spreading warmth where there had once been cold. Inside the mansion, the light continued to spread, each room now bathed in the glow of a new day. The dark corners that had once been consumed by shadow now gleamed with the soft light of the morning, the air fresh with the scent of new beginnings. The figure, standing in the heart of the house, could feel the change deep within. It was not just the mansion that had shifted, it was the world itself. The mansion, once a prison, now stood as a testament to everything that had been lost and everything that had been found. It had been a place of torment, of hunger, of death. But now, it was something else. It was a place of light, a place of rebirth. And in the stillness, as the house settled into its new form, the figure could feel the presence of Evelyn, not as a shadow, not as a memory, but as something more. She had been lost, but she had not been forgotten. Her essence, her spirit, lingered in the walls, in the very air. She was part of this house, part of its past, but she was no longer its prisoner. She was free. As the mansion settled into its new existence, the light that had entered its heart continued to grow, filling every room, every hall, every crack in the stone. The house, though still grand and imposing, was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of life, a place that had found its redemption, a place where the past could be laid to rest. The mansion, now awake, stood against the breaking dawn. A new beginning, a new chapter. The light that had touched it would never fade, and with it, the house would no longer hunger. It would simply exist, alive, breathing, and waiting for the next soul to step inside, no longer to consume, but to be part of its story. The mansion, in all its grandeur and darkness, had become something more. It had become a home once again, and as the sun rose, the last remnants of the night, of the storm, of the darkness, were cast aside. The mansion stood in the light, waiting, not to claim, but to embrace what was to come.